All right, let's get started now. So this morning we have the opportunity to hear from two of the foremost experts, at least from a social science point of view, on cybersecurity at the moment in the world. And first on the program is Dr. Bren Valeriano. Dr. Valeriano is a reader at Cardiff University, and is also the Donald Bren Chair of Armed Conflict at the Marine Corps University. He's the editor, or one of the editors, of the Journal of Cybersecurity, published by Oxford University Press. He's published 4 books, am I right? Yeah? Dozens of articles across a broad range of interests. I was interested to see you have an article in soccer and society too. It just shows how wide your interests are. And as actively sought to engage with policymakers and policy debates, which is relevant for us today because he's trying to go beyond the ivory tower and engage in some of the public debates on cybersecurity with publications in various outlets like Washington Post, Slate, Business Insider, Foreign Affairs, Defense One, and the list goes on and on and on. Most importantly for our purposes, Brendan recently authored an important book on cyber war versus cyber reality. And he's now working on another book about cyber coercion, the evolving character of cyber power and strategy. So Brendan, thanks a lot for coming here today, and the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Hi, thank you for having me. I was glad to get to El Paso. I've spent a lot of time in Texas, but nothing this far west. So far west, I did not realize you were in a different time zone, so I have to reschedule some events later today that are on Eastern time. So my talk today will be about this project I have, the era of cyberpeace, considering economics and also the uses of cyber tactics. I'm a bit of a cyber moderate, as I'll explain, but the real issue that we have to deal with is that there is this perception that this has been a breakout year for cyber conflict. Well, the last 2 years, basically. You had the Sony hack, OPM, IRS, Ashley Madison, the DNC hack, Yahoo. The idea is that cyber conflict is prevalent and it's normal. But this flies against a lot of evidence and macro perspectives that we can take on the event. And actually, my students made me have a Halloween costume, so I'm bringing out the scariest thing to a cybersecurity scholar, anonymous, so I have to put that like that, if that will hang on for a bit. But from the perspective of anonymous, I'm gonna walk around, I can hopefully be loud enough. The idea is that anonymous is an effective organization and unit in cybersecurity, but that is belayed by the ineffectiveness of the organization overall. Now, if you're in anonymous, please don't hack me. I know you can get to me, but in a list of over 300 threats Anonymous has made, not one of them has been successful, except for one, I'm sorry. It was in Oklahoma. They threatened a police office, and that police office backed down. The idea is that cyber is effective, that cyber is changing how we're fighting wars. And I'm kind of questioning that discourse through using social science. On the contrary, there's a developing cyber norm against the use of severe cyber tactics as directed by states against one another. The perception of cyber war is not reality. We've entered an era of cyber peace. We have not entered an era of cyber peace in terms of espionage and disruption, but espionage and disruption are completely different things than warfare. Warfare is about violence. Warfare is about the power to hurt. And the use of the analogy of war in the area of cybersecurity is entirely and utterly unhelpful. And I think that if we follow too far along with this analogy, we are going to prepare for the wrong things. We need to prepare for the everyday. We need to prepare for protecting civilians. We need to prepare for attacking our networks. We need to prepare for dealing with third-party contractors, which tend to be the highest vulnerability in the American government. But preparing for direct cyber war is an entirely different question. Now, for me, my perspective is as a cyber moderate. People call me a cyber skeptic, but I think the cybersecurity field is divided to what is thought of as two camps. One is the cyber prognosticators and one is the cyber skeptics. And the prognosticators assert that the future of war will be a digital war. That's a bit tough to conceive from a strategic coercion perspective. Cyber, I believe, will be an additive technology. It will be something that helps everyone in terms of how we run our lives and how we do everything we've ever done throughout the history of humanity. But will we fight direct cyber battles? That's a bit difficult to conceive strategically. You can think about it, but then you end up in the realm of science fiction. And then, of course, you have cyber skeptics. Those people would deny that there is cyber conflict at all. And I certainly do not deny that. But I would suggest that there's a middle point. There's a middle ground. And this middle ground is important for policy, because we cannot make policy based on worst case predictions or worst case scenarios before we deal with policy based on the everyday, before we deal with the important middle range objectives we need to make. And we also need to think about the individual, not necessarily the state. And I think that's one of the reasons my work is moving more towards cyber repression, and that I find not a lot of evidence of conflict between states in the cyber realm. But what you do see is the use of cyber technologies to attack protesters, activists, and journalists. And I think that is the real fear we have in the future. Not that America and Russia will get into a direct cyber war, but that major states will use these technologies to harm and harass enemies of the state. The position typified by Valeriano and Menes with such states that cyber conflict will occur, but the conflicts themselves will be trivial, will not result in a change of behavior in the target, and will largely be regional cyber incidents connected to traditional international issues at stake between states. This leads us to question the director of the future uses of the tactic. So I should explain that when we do see cyber conflict, we see it from the perspective of exasperating or supporting long-standing international relations disputes. So the first thing is we need to understand the context of cyber operations. You cannot understand the Sony hack by North Korea without understanding the history of North Korea, the history of the rivalry between North Korea, South Korea, and the United States, and how North Korea has acted before. It is not a surprising move if you understand North Korean behavior. The other thing too is a lot of these conflicts tend to be trivial. Like say the DNC hack, the idea that Russia was hacking into American electoral voting rolls. The problem with that is those voting rolls could be purchased. All they did is hack into something you can buy online already. They did not affect the integrity of the election, but they did affect the trust that we have in elections. And this is something that I want to focus on. The idea of the individual being important, the idea of perception being important. Quite often the scenarios we make in our mind about cybersecurity are far worse than what is actually happening. And this distracts us and leads to bad policy. And this is problematic in general. No one is skeptical of cyber technology. There are only researchers who are skeptical of the hyperbolic pronouncements that are made in the cyber revolution, that there is a cyber revolution. A friend of mine, Sean Lawson, has a paper that goes through 30 years of the use of the term cyber Pearl Harbor. This term is 30 years old. It was ramped up again with Podesta, Panetta said it in about 2006, 2007. It's been used a lot more frequently since then, but this is a very old term that's thrown out over and over again. And I question if people even understand what Pearl Harbor means in that context, because Pearl Harbor was a dramatic failure for the Japanese. But the idea that there are those harbingers of the future is prevalent in the cyber discourse. The problem is we've been talking about these harbingers of the future for the last 30 years. This has become an old discipline in some ways. The people who started this with government have now retired long ago. Has cyber changed international interactions? I don't think so, but it's clearly something we need to be aware of, we need to worry about, we need to build policy on. But the question is really, how are we going to build policy? We need cyber theory and data. Too much in cybersecurity as a field is done based on prognostication. And one thing I should highlight too is if you read news reports about cybersecurity, the majority of people quoted are people who run cybersecurity firms. They have a vested interest in promoting and hyping the cyber threat. There are not people who give you a balanced perspective. And this is a fault of the news media that we can blame for a lot of things, but this is particularly true in cybersecurity. This is why we need data. This is why we need theory. This is why we need evidence. We need to understand the contours of the domain before we can make pronouncements as to how it occurs. We do this in every life. Everything we do in business is based on data, except for cybersecurity. Now, of course, firms are vulnerable. Individuals are vulnerable, but quite often they're vulnerable because of their own making. You know, I need to do a study at some point, but the question would be, how many firms use IT to be their cybersecurity office? And quite often, that is exactly what happens. The guy down the hall that sets up your network is also the one that protects your network. There needs to be two different things there. We need to have a better conception of what cybersecurity is. Quite often, the flaws and failures we have in this domain are because we are not prepared to deal with the everyday, the basics. So while we are witnessing a rise of cyber conflict, there is no precipitous increase in the severity of cyber incidents. And this is very true if you even look at this in the context of war. Could you see cyber conflict being used in the wars in Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, but not to a dramatic effect, not to a great effect where they're dependent on in operations. And this is becoming an issue too in war games and planning, where we're looking at using cyber tools. But the reality is that cyber tools are untested and unprecedented. And the other problem is that if we do use cyber tools for military effect, we're not exactly sure they will work, but if they do work, the probability of them working twice is very, very low. So depending on these tools would be folly from a military perspective. The other thing we see is actors are restrained from responding to cyber incidents. Now, we all know about the DNC hack recently. We all know about the call to respond against Russia. Everyone thought it would be a direct operation against Russia from the cyber perspective. Of course, what happened? We talked Ecuador into cutting off Julian Assange's email, and we cut off money to Russia Today. And also, likely America or someone hacked into Putin's right-hand man and released their emails. But it was not a precipitous increase in escalation. And that's what people generally expect to happen. But there has been a large amount of managed operations between cyber aggressions in cyberspace. And this is something we need to understand. There's been a lot more restraint than we would have expected otherwise. A great proportion of cyber actions fall into the domain of espionage. And this is a key question because we keep talking about this from the perspective of war. But really what we're seeing is a continuation of espionage. Really what we're seeing is a continuation of what we've seen during the Cold War, where someone will do something, they'll steal information, they'll indict someone, they'll kick someone out of the country, and it'll be tick for that tat from that perspective, but escalation will be managed. That's what the era of cyber security has become. But the discourse is about cyber Pearl Harbor. The discourse is about cyber war. The discourse is about grandma getting her pacemaker hacked into and dying. That is not the reality. That is movies. That is science fiction. We need to prepare for the everyday. Like Vasquez, we believe that political and international relations theories should be able to explain the past, present, and future. And I think we have a large corpus of events in the past, in the present, so that we can be able to explain the future. There are too many futurists in the cybersecurity field, and that's something that social scientists should not commit to following along. That we need to be better than that. Evidence of cyber peace? The fact is there have been no major cyber attacks between countries that have risen to any serious level of danger. One of the most recent that people will talk about will be Black Energy in Ukraine. 80,000 people lost power in Ukraine. They lost power at 3 a.m. 70,000 people had their power restored within an hour because they simply went to the substations and switched to breakers. That's all that happened. That is not a major incident as we would determine it from international relations perspectives. But the news media blows it out of proportion, of course. It's a significant event in terms of what could be done, but it also tells us quite a bit about what should be done to protect ourselves. We need redundancy. We need resiliency. If we set up cyber-only systems, we are then vulnerable. The funniest thing that does happen on Twitter quite often is when these hotels network themselves, and they network themselves through the internet, and they control the doors, the temperature, and then they have a hacker conference, and the whole hotel just basically blows up because there is no security from that domain. We need to be careful about how far we go. We need to be careful about the records we keep. Russia's reaction in terms of buying thousands of typewriters is probably going a bit too far, but we need to think about what records we have and where things are stored, and about the integrity of information, because the integrity of information is likely the deepest fear we have. It's not that we're going to go to war over cyber conflict, but we may lose our data because we don't back it up, we don't secure it, we don't make sure the things we're looking at actually say the things they mean or are supposed to say. So the closest we have is Russia, Georgia, Estonia. Tell you a story about Estonia. Am I going to be in the news on this? No, I hope not. I was in Estonia. I was on a panel with the President Thomas Ives talking about the cyber war of Estonia in 2007, the greatest event in this country ever. They were harmed. They were devastated. And I was arguing, no, of course not. Actually, they chose to be disconnected when they were attacked by Russia. They basically took themselves offline to protect themselves. And backstage, he just kind of said, yeah, I agree with you. I was just doing it for dramatic effect. This is what happens. People do these things and promote this fear because there's a lot of money to be made. And that's true. And we need to be careful about what we set up to protect ourselves. But overreacting is not helpful. Another good example is Saudi Arabia. So America and Israel, or now Israel is just claiming responsibility for the attack on Iran. But we attacked the Nantes plant, Stuxnet. It's become the cyber World War I. The idea was to either degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities or to prevent Israel from attacking. In any case, Iran's response was to not attack America, to not attack Israel, but to attack Aramco, Saudi Arabia's oil production facilities. What happened? They blew up, or they kind of destroyed 12,000 computers, but no information was lost. No drilling operations were affected because Saudi Arabia was prepared for such attack. But that does show that escalation is not the norm. Instead, they did something lower against someone else because they did not want to escalate with the United States and Israel. So when you actually dive into these examples of cyber war, you find a lot less there than you would expect given the discourse. These examples, though, outweigh the volumes of other operations of states failing to effectively use cyber tactics against one another, are utilizing cyber methods to probe potential vulnerabilities, but going no further. What we see is quite often probes. We see is quite often preparation. And that's something every state should do to prepare for any future battle. But in terms of actually using cyber as a method to hurt civilians and other members of a state in the context of war, this becomes very, very unlikely. And I'll talk a lot more about why it's unlikely in a talk tomorrow, but that's a whole other book project. What we are seeing in the international system is a lot of rain in the form of cyber attacks, but no wind, snow, and sleet in the form of cyber destruction. In fact, probably the most important piece I've seen written on cybersecurity was in the Foreign Policy magazine written by Cyber Squirrel. Yes, Cyber Squirrel. Squirrels are organized, they're prepared, they have killed people, they are destroying critical infrastructure by chewing through power lines. They are the most devastating threat we have to critical infrastructure, and there's data to prove that. In terms of using cyber to attack critical infrastructure, we see a lot of probes, but not a lot of evidence of attacks. Actually, quite often, one of the most cited incidents about critical infrastructure attacks on power plants is someone taking a sniper rifle and shooting at a transformer. I don't know how that relates to cybersecurity, but it's some sort of idea that this is evidence that we are vulnerable. Of course we're ever vulnerable to someone taking a sniper rifle. Of course we're vulnerable to squirrels. But in terms of other human beings and other states, we have actually entered into a dramatic era of peace. What we see here is the number of cyber incidents. That's the blue line. Of course, it goes up, and it's been going up through the years. But the trend line for severity has been stable and, in fact, generally minimal through the years. So there is this sort of evidence of a low-level kind of burn in terms of cybersecurity, but there has been no fire. There's no sort of inferno that people kind of talk about. And this is why I argue for cyber restraint. Cyber restraint is a strategic underpinning of how many states confront cyber actions. States deal with these actions in a restrained manner because, for the most important reason, is we are all vulnerable. Just by definition, cybersecurity means that the majority of major states, and particularly democratic states, are vulnerable. There's a mutually assured destruction there, that we depend on these technologies to run our daily lives. And because of how these technologies work, there's no way to really kind of control them. There's no such thing as an internet kill switch. You couldn't kill the internet between America and the rest of the world because we have cables undersea, we have satellites, we have so many different options, it's virtually impossible to do so. Some countries are secure, but those countries are North Korea, where there are no information going in and out. And that's the paradox we have. The most secure states in cybersecurity tend to be the least free and the most cut off from the rest of the world. So there's sort of mutually assured destruction we have in cyberspace. As David Sanger recounts in the New York Times, in a series of classified meetings, officials have struggled to choose among options that range from largely symbolic responses to more significant actions that some officials fear could lead to escalation of hacking between the two countries. And this is the real question, that escalation is to be avoided. We've managed to maintain a system of peace since World War II. We managed to maintain a system of peace when the great powers had direct antagonism and nuclear weapons to wipe each other out, and we've avoided direct confrontations. Why would we expect the cyber era to be any different? In fact, we actually have more control over cybersecurity than we do over a lot of conventional weapons, given the legal implications. You cannot distinguish cyber weapons that target military and government from cyber weapons that would target civilians. There is no distinction between civilian space and military space because these two things bleed together eventually. And the greatest illustration of that is the Stuxnet attack, where that virus, that worm, bled out to the civilian space eventually. And this was an air gap facility in the middle of nowhere. If that worm can get out, anything can get out anywhere. Some of the most cantankerous states in the system tend to behave in a responsible manner. Or even when they behave in an irresponsible manner, it tends to be counterintuitive to what you would expect. My favorite story is that China taught North Korea how to hack. Guess what North Korea did? They went right back home and they hacked China. They didn't hack America. They didn't hack South Korea right away. They eventually did, of course. But they went right back and hacked their patron. This is the problem with cybersecurity, the unpredictability, but we do not have a problem of escalation. So one reason there's restraint is reproducibility of the tactic. These weapons are continuously able to be used. You unleash code on the world, it can be modified and reused by anyone. That is why America is very restrained in its use of its own code, because once it uses that code, it cannot use it again because those vulnerabilities will be eventually shored up. The other thing is that cyber weapons are obviously not simple to design. We have this idea, or the Trump idea, of 400-pound hackers sitting in his basement making these weapons. Stuxnet, the attack on Iran, cost over $300 million, 3 years, cooperation between Israel and American intelligence sources, which of course is not easy, and also the culpability of industrial private firms. It was not an easy operation. But we tend to think of these operations as quick, as fast, as easy to develop. But actually, if you look at these developing operations, they tend to be very, very difficult to conceive. We have this idea of zero-day exploits. These are these sort of vulnerabilities that will allow you to hack into a system. The problem is one zero-day exploit on its own probably is useless. You need to chain these together into multiple zero-day exploits to actually achieve something. Or even the most dramatic thing America did with Stuxnet was map that nuclear operation, that nuclear facility, before attacking it. That is probably the most important thing that happened with that operation because of how long it took for us to map that network. But in terms of what we actually did to that network was not exactly that significant as you would be led to believe. The third reason for restraint, as I've suggested, is collateral damage. Quite often, the things I hear talked about in U.S. government and the military throughout the world, in Europe also, when you talk about launching cyber operations, you become very close to talking about launching operations that can achieve a large amount of collateral damage. And no matter what you may say about the U.S. military, they have gone to great lengths to reduce collateral damage. But that is very difficult to achieve with cyber operations just because how these things bleed out to normal space. You could target them to specific systems, but there's no guarantee that they will stay located and targeted on those specific systems. And number 4, there's a high potential for diffusion, for dragging in third parties. Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, was dragged into the conflict between America, Iran, and Israel. We would expect that to happen just by how things have happened throughout history. But there is this great potential to drag in other states. And then, of course, you have the big fear of blowback. That's the real problem, that we have managed to be restrained for so long. We have managed to kind of keep these massive cyber weapons, if they actually do exist, under lock and key. But if we choose to actually use them, there will be dramatic repercussions. There will be blowback. And as I've said, the great democratic societies are vulnerable because how ubiquitous cyber technology is. And that would lead me to suggest that I think one of the most important things we need to do from an interdisciplinary perspective is start to look at the psychological, behavioral, and individual impact of cyber operations. I have friends in Israel that did experiments on individuals, and they found that the fear of cyber terrorism is not dramatically different than the fear of conventional terrorism. The fears we create in our own mind because of the vulnerability and the sort of dependency we have on cyber technology is probably more important and more devastating than the reality of how these weapons are used. And that's something we need to think about. How our biology has changed, how our dependency has changed. What would it feel like to take away a phone from like a 13-year-old child that now depends on that phone for everything they do? This is something that's changed how we behave. And because of it, we are now utterly vulnerable. But are we vulnerable from states? Or are we vulnerable because these are just something that we've developed on our own? Evidence of restraint. We have a lot more incidents in our updated data set, but in our older data set, we had 111 significant incidents between states. 87 of them, 78% had no response. 17 or 15% had a cyber response. 7 or 6% had a militarized response, which is generally a threat of militarized force in response to that cyber action. And only 1.8% had both a cyber and mid response. What you tend to see there is a lack of response. And quite often, I think the best course of action is in some ways just to ignore it and not provoke a response and not provoke escalation. But this will get to the question we have to really think about too, is not the military domain. Cyber war is inflated. Cyber war is a horrible topic. It's a horrible word because it doesn't exist. War by definition means violence against individuals. We have never seen cyber violence against an individual. But the real question is about the risk of cybercrime and how that has proliferated. And now we've seen for the last, what is this? This is from 2011 to 2014, the fear of cybercrime and cyber conflict has increased through time. So in 2011, it's 39% of people saw a great risk from cybercrime, and that increased to 48% in 2014. And undoubtedly, it likely has increased once again by 2016. What we are advocating, me and my co-authors, is this idea of cyber shrinkage. Now, I assume a lot of you are in business. You probably have heard of this term. This is why I like non-traditional academics being part of academia. I worked in big box stores. When I grew up, I worked in Staples and Office Depot, and we had this concept of shrinkage, which is assumed loss by volume. That if you have such a big warehouse, you're going to lose things. People are going to steal things. Employees are going to steal things. Every day I would pick up empty printer cartridges because that's just what happened. That's just the cost of doing business when you have such a big store that you cannot monitor loss. Our theory of cyber shrinkage will be based on this concept of shrinkage given a liberal market economy. 1% to 2% of losses is acceptable loss according to volume given certain contexts and given operating under a large volume. Without putting crime into a proper context, securitizing cyberspace could be the result. And that's what we have done. We have gone overboard in talking about cyber losses and how we deal with the problem of cybercrime. In fact, if you really investigate it, if you really look at it, what we are seeing is probably the cost of doing business. It's not something to be condoned. It's not something to be accepted. But when we change our frame and understand that losses are a part of doing business, we then need to rethink how we deal with these threats. And by militarizing this domain, by going too far and giving government control over this domain, we tend to lose who we are as individuals, as corporations, and as private entities. And that's the real fear. Because the discourse has been in other states that we need cybersecurity because it will protect the individual. But the real question is, how much at stake is the individual? How much at stake is the business? Citizens are limited to online activities due to the popular fear of where governments pass laws based on a few popularized incidents such as the Sony hack. So we are changing how we do business because of these popular incidents. But for high-profile data breaches on retailers last few years, Target, Home Depot, eBay, Neiman Marcus, we demonstrate that these losses are within the realm of shrinkage. When you look at total revenues and online revenues and then calculate the net loss for each high-profile data breach, divide these losses by total revenues, you see that there's evidence of cyber shrinkage being that these losses should be accepted by volume. And this does not even account for cyber insurance, if that's a real thing. I'm not still convinced that's really a thing, but it's become a great industry. For the most part, online sales are only a small fraction of those retail revenues. But as these retailers expand into the online domain, we need to reconsider how we accept losses in this domain. Even in the face of being compromised by hackers, these companies continue to move more and more of their inventory online. So they cry foul, they want support from the US government, but then they continue to do more and do more things that actually leave them vulnerable. Sony is the greatest example. Is what 2011, PlayStation Online went down for about 3 months. So no one could play Call of Duty for 3 months. It was a tragic period in everyone's lives. But then once again, you had the Sony hack in 2015? They were warned. Forbes went in a few months after to the cybersecurity organization within Sony and found it entirely unmanned and no one was at their desks. These companies do not do the most basic in terms of protecting themselves. But then if you do look at it from the perspective of shrinkage, you look at these 4 major breaches. 2013 for Target and Home Depot, 2014 for eBay and Neiman Marcus. The only one that goes beyond the 1% to 2% shrinkage percentage is the Target loss. And of course, Target does continue to proliferate online despite that major loss. But if you put these losses in context, you find very little evidence that these losses should not have been expected based on how we operate. And that's one of the basic messages we need to think about. As cyber technology has changed how we live, as it's become one of the greatest advances we've ever had in society for the last 200 years, of course there will be negative repercussions. Of course there will be challenges. But how we react to these challenges matters. And quite often we overreact and react in the wrong way. We react in the frame of warfare. We should be thinking about how cyber technologies can embolden our ability to act in terms of research, in terms of social connections, in terms of business connections, but instead we have gone further and further towards militarizing the domain. Regardless of data breaches in the 4 cases presented above, all 4 large retailers continue to put more and more of their inventory online. They've been burned, yet they do not change their behavior because it's economically prudent to do so. They are benefiting. But the story they tell is a boo-hoo-hoo, we've been hacked, we need government support, but there are trade-offs when the government gets involved in these areas. And we need to think about those trade-offs. It seems online sales is the future for these retailers, regardless of the threat from cybercrime. This implies that the gains to be had from the online sales still outweigh the losses. We're going to gain more from online connectivity than we'll ever lose. But if we keep talking about this as a negative, it will change the possibilities and limit our future. And that's something we don't want to do. We do not want to limit our future because we are fearful. As human beings, we are often fearful. As human beings, we often react poorly to threats. But how we react in cybersecurity can dramatically change how we will utilize this tool in the future. Assuming we accept a certain amount of cyber shrinkage, then how do we minimize these losses? We need to think about sensitive information and how we keep it protected. The Opm Hack in the US government, where we lost 6 million fingerprints and 12 million records. That hack was done through a third-party contractor. That's how it came about. It wasn't that anyone got in directly through the US government, although that's certainly possible, but we do need to think about what we do with our information and how we protect it. If we leave it out in the open, if we leave it unencrypted, if we leave these sorts of vulnerability points, someone will come and take it. Not because they're evil, but because it's basically like leaving $20 on the floor and then getting mad because someone came and picked it up. We worry about war, but we don't worry about keeping the important things we need to protect in our own pockets. That's what we need to think about when we think about cybersecurity. To allow for more access would lead the producer at greater risk. And that's something we need to consider. How do we engage ourselves online? How far do we go? Do we put all our bank data on our phones? Do we do everything online? When's the last time anyone here has been in a bank? Actually physically been in a bank? Remember we used to have our little books that, had our savings account. It was so cute when every little kid would get that and they'd keep up with it. No one does that anymore. How much do you actually have? How much do you actually know you have? We've gone too far in terms of trust. My point is about how we think about cybersecurity. If we're fearful, if we go too far, we cut off avenues of connection. We cut off the possibilities. We do too much in the frame of war. And we're not really operating in a war frame. We have no thirst for war anymore. We don't want to go into Syria. We don't want to go in the Middle East because of problems we've had. But we do seem to want to do this in cybersecurity. We think it's fun. We think it's interesting. We think it's new. But the potential harm, given our dependency in this framework, makes us dramatically vulnerable. And that's something we need to think about. How much of these vulnerabilities are of our own making? One of my favorite movies about cybersecurity was Skyfall, the James Bond movie. And if you remember in that movie, MI6 blows up through an external attack on their heating system. I think that's really bad plumbing, not bad cybersecurity. But do we need to network our lights? Do we need to network our heating? Is that really a good idea? Are we gone too far in making things easy? And then when we go too far in this cybersecurity framework, we look for someone to protect ourselves because we cannot understand these technologies. I used to be good at these. I used to break down computers. I used to do a little bit of hacking back in the day when I was a kid. That was 20, 30 years ago. I can't even take apart a laptop at this point. We have no conception of what we have in our pockets. And because of that, we are scared about the possibilities. We're scared that Russia's going to get us. Of course, Russia wants to get us because they're pissed at us. But if we protect ourselves, if we protect the information we have, and we don't overreact, we can survive this era of cyber threat.